This is a visual essay about something we experience every day, but probably have never run across the official name for what is happening. Cathetus is about the way the vanishing point in perspective seems to follow us as we move around. Beneath this simple idea, however, is a complex set of relations that extend to the foundations of psychoanalysis. Lacan touches on Cathetus when he uses the analogy of the slide rule to explain how the other, known as the big other, or Autre in French, is related to the little other, the indefinable idea of the lack or gap that Lacan designates as the objet petit, the object cause of desire. In his slide rule analogy, Lacan compares the big A other with the unit of 1, which he shows can be divided by combinations of the little a, the objet petit, to create mathematical sequences equivalent to the Fibonacci number series, which produces the ratio phi, an irrational number that, like the unary trait that Lacan identifies with the unit 1, is not a number at all, but rather a relationship. Lest we think this is a bit too abstract, Lacan brings up the subject of the slide rule's relation to sex, a non-relation that is, like the Fibonacci number series, a matter of backs and forths, odds and evens. In the example of Pyramus and Thisbe, two young people whose houses share a common wall, romance blooms because they find a way to speak to each other through a small crack. Falling in love, they make plans to meet outside of town, but you know the story. Thisbe is early and scared off by a lion. Pyramus is late and finds her bloodied scarf and thinks her dead. He kills himself, and when Thisbe finds him, she too commits suicide. In this back and forth of one tragic misunderstanding after another, we realize true love through the series of losses and understand the Fibonacci ratio phi as a kind of fate, a depth, imposed over flat expectations. So why not talk about perspective space from the start? We are used to the idea of seeing how a point in the distance is where parallel lines seem to meet up, but we are told by Euclid that this is a fiction, that the lines only seem to meet. Because they are parallel, they never converge. But in our actual visual experience, we witness convergence and see the point as actual. We could normally handle this contradiction between experience and logic, but other effects, such as Cathetus, the way the vanishing point seems to move with us as we change position, seems just a little bit uncanny, no matter how commonplace it is. It is uncanny because, when we stop to think about it, we need words like Cathetus to get at what is happening. The painter, sculptor, architect Filippo Brunelleschi was the first to assert the similarity between the picture as a kind of window to the functions of a mirror. The main takeaway of his experiment, that is usually taken to demonstrate the reality of linear perspective, is not as important for us as his identification of Cathetus as the way the subjective viewer seems to be tracked and paralleled in a spooky way by the objective vanishing point. Brunelleschi's naming of the line I'm showing here in pink is based on the analogy of the picture plane as a mirror. This seems harmless enough, but what is a mirror? Most people would say that a mirror image is a reflection, but this is actually not entirely true. The mirror is, more properly speaking, a cut into space. We know this because the mirror image reverses things left and right, but not top and bottom, which it would were it a reflection. A mirror is more like cutting an apple in two and then looking at the separate halves. We see that one side is a left-handed version, the other is a right-handed version. This is a phenomenon called chirality. It's like odds and evens in the number series. and I'm hoping to be able to show that this relates directly to Lacan's emphasis on how, in his slide rule, the little a's combine to produce a series of numbers that are the increasing powers of A. You know from powering the number 2 that values increase exponentially, 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, etc. This becomes critical when Lacan compares this increase to the way that things seem to diminish in size the further away they are in our perspective view when A is less than 1. If the mirror is a cut rather than a reflection, it explains how Cathetus works to allow the vanishing point to seem to slide along with us as we move laterally, side to side, parallel to the picture plane. The surface is orthogonal because the right angle that defines the relation of our line of sight to the picture plane affects the whole surface. As we move, the angle also moves, and the surface is defined as a stereogram, which is something we must look at with our eyes at a 90-degree angle from the picture plane. You probably already know how to look at a stereogram. If you don't see a cube as you stare out into the infinite space, you are not allowing the pattern to fold over itself to create the small difference that will make the cube image emerge. I can show you what a cube looks like more or less, but once you see this, you will focus on the picture plane and lose the ability to see the actual 3D pattern that your brain decides is the best way to sort out the data it's given. To see a stereogram image, your gaze has to be a stare out into space that is cathetic or perpendicular to the surface of representation. When the image emerges, you can actually make it rotate a bit from side to side, demonstrating the connection to Cathetus. Although you know that the image comes from the pattern that is only two-dimensional, the 3D effect is something produced by the small differences that provoke your brain to come up with a different explanation. The 2D surface actually seems to thicken to accommodate the cube in this case. So to sum up, our everyday visual experience involves a perspective that not only requires us to regard the vanishing point as something more than a fiction of geometry, but as something that is intimate to our subjectivity. As we move, it moves. We notice this only in the case of lateral motion that is parallel to the picture plane, and with a stare that forces us to see the infinity of the point that somehow spookily coordinates its movements with ours. Now that we have a name for this parallel movement, Cathetus, we can think more productively about what Lacan means when he talks about a slide rule that we can take to bed with us. The big A, or other, is what we construct in our imagination about who or what can recognize that we exist. This other has to be something that wants something of us, and we seek recognition from this other by making repeated demands, or rather calls, to secure the other's recognition. These calls and the mysterious unknown desire of the other are two sides of the same coin. This is why there is a back and forth between the odd and even values of the little a. Our calls are always too little or too much, but each call ratchets us closer to the ideal point in the distance, which is like the Fibonacci phi. If you've never seen a slide rule before, it was in common use before the advent of electronic hand calculators. It worked by making evenly divided scales appear as logarithmic and logarithmic scales appear as evenly divided. Lacan seems to know about this because he does the same thing with the powers of the objet petit. He makes them arithmetic on one scale at the surface of the slide rule, but then he shows how they are increasingly smaller intervals because each A is smaller than 1, the number he equates with the big other. The smaller intervals are organized in a zigzag of odds and evens, in a way that seems to suggest the same logic as the vanishing point. Little a to the nth power would be the hypothetical point at an infinite distance away, but indicated on the surface of the slide rule as the smallest zag after the next smallest zig. Arranged in order of a to the lowest to the highest power, the series of increasingly smaller values of the objet petit a construct a kind of orthogonal screen that combs our gaze into it, looking past what we see inscribed on the surface of the scale to see a thickened space where a figure emerges. Returning to the example of Pyramus and Thisbe, the wall separating the two lovers is thickened, but it is also made hollow. It is filled with the fantasies of the boy and girl, fantasies that are the left and right-hand version of each other. They never merge. They create a void that is inside the wall, a kind of poche space, as it's called in architecture, and this void corresponds to the couple's needs to meet in an exterior void, the wilderness where one will be early and one will be late. One will be thought dead but actually living, then the other is living but then wishing himself dead. Just as in architecture the living and dead are constantly changing places inside the walls, lovers necessarily change places on either sides of the wall. Now it's time to take this idea of the orthogonal comb to a famous historical example where the word Cathetus never has appeared. In Sigmund Freud's famous story about forgetting the name of the painter whose murals he has just seen during his trip to the Adriatic regions, he tries to remember but comes up with a lot of cases of, no, that's not it. He thinks of Bosnia and Herzegovina. He thinks of Botticelli and then Boltraffio, two other painters. Then he hears an ex-patient of his has died in a small town named Treffe. He converses with a fellow traveler about how respectful Turks in these regions always call their doctors Sir or Herr in German, and how they would rather die than do without sex. Freud bundles this forgetting of a proper name to slips of the tongue and bungled explanations under the heading of parapraxis. For us, however, the important Lacanian takeaway is what Freud does, remember, is held together as a series of loose chains of words that work as metonymies. A metonymy is divided into two parts, a vivid sensual part that works to identify it, and a part that is like extra baggage. The sensual part is there for those who have ears to hear and eyes to see. It is anamorphically present, something not noticed in the ordinary conventional use of the word or object. Freud figures out that he has suppressed Signorelli's name because it contains signor, and the German for signor is Herr, and this has become the latent part of a whole series of words, beginning with Herzegovina, ending with stories about Turks who, like his ex-patient, value sex over death. Metonymy is what has allowed these signifiers to form a chain held together by the latent term, but Lacan puts his finger on the important fact that Freud has seen something in the name Signorelli that native speakers of Italian do not see. We can go one step further and say that when you see something others don't see, this is called anamorphosis. Anamorphosis is a big deal for Lacan, but we normally isolate it to the examples he gives in Seminar 8, The Ethics of Psychoanalysis, where he talks about Hans Holbein's famous painting The Ambassadors, with its anamorphic skull. There's more to the picture, and as Mladen Dollar has claimed, anamorphosis can cover almost every idea that Lacan ever had if we work hard enough to see the connection. Here, we can see how the latent signifier in Freud's parapraxis has worked like an anamorphic image, how it has served to bring about a metaphoric condition, a chain of signifiers that is held together in a cloud by a kind of atmospheric gravity. In this next little animation, I invite you to think about anamorphosis in relation to the orthogonal comb that gets our brains to create a thickened space within the 2D space of representation, and how this 2D works like a cloud of metonymies. It's up to you to make associations that make sense of these cathetic diagrams and their relation to Lacan's slide rule. The diagrams reach the point where they look a lot like Lacan's formula for metaphor, where signifiers emerge as the result of something being suppressed. In the slide rule analogy, we get to look under the hood of Lacan's engine and see how perspectival order emerges out of a chiralistic odds and evens situation. In the creation of an orthogonal comb that forces us to look out into infinity, a space emerges in the middle, a kind of cloud that we experience for real when we look at any stereogram. We know for sure at this point that the brain's desire to maintain law and order is the ultimate big other, that our personal perceptual experiences are calls we make on this big other to certify our presence as observers, as spectators, as subjects who have a place to stand within the visible scene, which is simultaneously a standing, a legitimacy in the eyes of the big other. When Freud looks at the word signorelli, he sees signor and translates it into the German word Herr. This makes a rebus appear from inside the conventional expression, or in terms of sound, it makes us hear what others don't, an acousmatic presence that is more authentic than the conventional word. In both the visual anamorphosis of the rebus and the acousmatic anamorphosis of the interior sound meant just for us, we see ourselves intimately connected with a vanishing point that is simultaneously at the radical exterior and radical interior. Lacan's slide rule packs a lot of computing power in one punch. We have chirality, anamorphosis, emergence, combined in the idea of the surface representation as a kind of stereogram. We also have an original take on Lacan's idea of metaphor as an intersection but not union between inside and outside points of view. Here we have to confirm our thesis by referring to another important element in Seminar 14, the so-called reference polygon of the torus, which is a diagram mathematicians use to describe how a projective 2D surface must be folded to create a form that is a pure surface, both continent and incontinent at the same time. In Seminar 14, The Logic of Fantasy, we see one diagram again and again, with Lacan failing to mention its basis, the reference polygon of the torus. But Lacan accurately tells the story of the torus when he describes how, out of the inversion of Descartes' claim that thinking, or rather speaking and being, are inextricably linked, to saying just the reverse, that speaking and being are more of a zero-sum game, that to do with one is to do without the other. This leads to two conditions, one that takes place within the zone of the symbolic, the neurotic who acts out, and the psychotic who, on the outside of the symbolic, can only imitate subjectivity. These two expanded cases come back from this equator of the torus to reduce not to a disk and then a disappearing point, but rather to a Mobius-like relationship of mutual castration, which would be puzzling if we didn't have a lot of fictional cases where each lover sacrifices something to give to the other, to celebrate what the other has just sacrificed, as in the O. Henry story about the wife who cuts off her hair to buy a gold chain for the watch the husband has sold to be able to buy her a jeweled comb. Pyramus and Thisbe do much the same thing. So do Romeo and Juliet. So we are quite justified to say that the slide rule is what we talk about when we talk about love. The preferred food of lovers is, of course, the donut or bagel, which can be cut in a twisty way that reveals that it is just two Mobius bands that have been glued together, hopefully with cream cheese. Donuts or bagels might not sound romantic, but the Mobius certainly explains how what we think is two is really one, and how one is really two again. The two conditions can never resolve. The impossibility of resolution, of course, is Lacan's famous challenge, that there is no such thing as a sexual relationship. Next time you order a bagel, make sure not to ask the waiter to cut it up this way. You'll just get yourself thrown out of the bakery. And then you would really need a little cathesis to get yourself moving again.